Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to tackle the topic of political culture. So let's dive right into the material here. Very straightforward lecture. We're going to define political culture. So what is political culture? We're going to identify some key American democratic values. So we're going to pinpoint certain things. It may be on some people's lists. It might not be on other people's lists. But we're going to discuss certain commonalities of American democratic values. We're going to discuss the importance of political socialization in American society, so where we get our views on politics. We're going to examine the features of a successful public opinion poll. And then finally, we're going to juxtapose, which is comparing side by side, the election of 1948 to that of 2008 and 2012. So we're going to see how things have changed in terms of how we're able to predict elections using public opinion polls. So, what is political culture? To define it very simply, it's a set of basic values and beliefs about a country or government that is shared by a majority of citizens. So, what people actually believe in, how we actually view these things here. Political culture influences political opinions and behaviors. So in the United States, our political culture fosters support for democratic processes and for the most part places support for civic responsibility. So, we have, a pretty solid support for democracy. There's no a mass of people that are wanting any type of monarchy system. There's a sense of democracy that is well established and part of our political culture. Our political culture provides the backdrop by which our system of government operates with all its idiosyncratic tendencies. So there are things in the United States that maybe we take for granted that's just simply not part of the culture in other democratic countries like in the UK or in Canada. They may have similar traditions, but we have a separate political culture that's is fairly unique, again, based on our constitutional history. So what are some democratic values? So, I pinpointed 6 democratic values. Again, there's nothing ironclad about these things. On the AP exam, you're not going to have a list of what are the 6 exact democratic values. But again, for an FRQ question, you might come across different things that require what is part of American democratic tradition and which are not. So I just chose 6 key ones that generally people would agree is part of. And it can be phrased in different ways too. Majority rule, minority rights. So although democracy is based on majority rule, the idea of minority rights exists. So for example, if a majority of people believe that all left-handed people should be taxed at higher rates than right-handers, our representatives probably, again, would not pass a left-hander's tax. Now, is it possible that they could? Yes. And if no one disputed it, then that would become the law of the land. But again, I think it's probably easy to argue that the due process, treating, left-handers equally as right-handers, there'd be a violation of rights. It's embedded in our Constitution. And so we have a system, set into place. Whereas in the UK, there is no constitution. Basically, laws that are passed, that becomes the law of the land. So our system of government is a little bit different, where we respect, majority rule, but there's this idea that minorities have a set of rights. Now, there's great debate as to, what groups of minorities, and over time, minority rights have increased over time, and sometimes they've been suppressed. But it's this idea that even if you're not part of the majority, you should still have the same rights as a part of the majority group here. Equality, again, this equality of every individual before the law and in the political process here. Now again, has it been the case where the United States has treated everyone equally? I think that's the answer to that question is patently obvious, again, with the existence of slavery up until the Civil War. But eventually blacks, women, 18-year-olds eventually were given equal rights of property white male, at least in terms of voting, through the 15th Amendment, through the 19th Amendment, through the 26th Amendment. This principle of equality, while it's taken some time, it's taken different shapes and forms, this principle of equality has kind of permeated American political culture. And again, does inequality still exist in the United States? Absolutely. And, definition of which, what is a legitimate group, what group is going to be granted, certain rights versus not rights. Again, this is a matter of legitimate debate, but this principle of equality of every individual, regardless of race, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, this principle, while, people might disagree on some of the specifics, this general, broad view of equality, of every individual, again, something where if you go to North Korea, you're definitely not going to have that as part of the political culture where, whatever, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, determines is said to be, the law. In the United States, there's this, political culture where everyone is equal, under the eyes of the law. Another democratic, value would be private property. So Americans believe that markets work with competition, information, incentives, and property rights. So Americans believe in the idea of free markets and letting people succeed or fail. Kind of the idea of almost survival of the fittest, the idea that if you take the risk, if you're an entrepreneur, then you deserve to reap the benefits of it. However, we believe in the idea of equality of opportunity, but not equality of results. So as much as people might lambast certain policies of President Obama and Obamacare and the idea of maybe a president leaning towards socialism, the idea is that we as Americans believe in the value of individual private property and profit. And so yes, we may have some measures that maybe redistribute wealth, but the general principle of equality of opportunity, but not necessarily equality of results, is pretty much embedded in our political culture. And also individual freedoms. So again, guarantees of civil liberties and protections against violations of rights. And we went through this in the lecture with amendments, particularly the First Amendment, the right to freedom of speech, the right to freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, freedom to petition against the government. These rights are part of what Americans hold dear, whereas in other countries, that might not be the case, where the government maybe has a little bit more sway. Again, a famous right, you have the right to remain silent, again, very popularized in Hollywood, of Miranda rights, but this is an actual right that people are given when they are arrested. They have the right to remain silent, so they have the right against having to incriminate themselves. So these rights are freedoms that are part of our American culture. Americans generally are given the benefit of the doubt in regards to individual freedom versus government power. Again, generally speaking, sometimes the government will say that for the interests of society, they're gonna give more power to the government. But again, as a general rule of thumb, Americans really value having these individual freedoms over government power. Another virtue of American democratic value would be compromise. So this allows for the combining of different opinions and interests to form solutions that meld ideas of different groups. So in parliamentary systems, like the UK, the majority passes what it wants, when it wants. And basically the minority party is there to say a lot of different things. But in essence, in a parliamentary system, whoever's in power, they have the opportunity to pass whatever their laws they want. And the benefit of that is that whatever they want, they get passed through, and you can kind of blame that party. Whereas in the United States, you have a Republican president or Democrat Congress. You have a Democrat president, Republican House of Representatives, but a Democrat Senate, and you have Supreme Court justices that lean Republican. There's a lot of people with differing opinions on how the government should be run. And so there's compromise. Now again, I say this here in our presidential government, compromise, and I kind of say this tongue-in-cheek, sometimes is built into our system of enacting public policy. Now, over the past couple of years, the partisan rancor has become a little bit more established with Obamacare passing with no Republican votes, the Clinton impeachment pretty much going on a straight partisan divide. Yes, we do have a lot of issues where there's not a whole lot of compromise, but it's the idea that our system of government requires some measure of compromise with a presidential form of government. So again, periods of history, there's been more compromise than in other periods, but again, our system is kind of built on the idea that there's compromise in what leaders of political parties are able to get, whereas in a parliamentary system, pretty much one party controls the entire government. And again, the idea here of limited government is a valued American democratic value. It's the idea that powers of governments are, or at least supposed to be, restricted to certain functions limited by the Constitution. Again, with the advent of technology and the NSA being able to have access to data maybe that it shouldn't be having access to, and utilizing it, and whether or not we're spying on our own citizens, whether we're spying on our enemies or our friends, it's a legitimate question what the scope of government should be, but there is a consensus that the government shouldn't have an all-encompassing role in citizen lives. So again, these are just some democratic values that Americans might share. Political socialization. What is this idea here? This is a process by which citizens acquire a sense of political identity. Begins early in childhood and takes full form through a combination of experiences here. So family influence is strongest when both parents identify with the same party. This, again, might actually come out as an AP multiple choice question. The idea of, what is the biggest indicator of how you're going to vote in the future? And how your family, how your mom and dad voted in terms of political identification, that's going to be fairly significant. Now, again, that is a generalization, but, for the most part, if there's two conservative parents, and the kid is generally going to be conservative. If you have two liberal Democrat parents, then the kid is generally going to adopt these values. Kind of common sense here. Now, one kind of exception to that, there's a TV show in the early mid 1980s. It's called Family Ties. Alex P. Keaton, shown right here, played by Michael J. Fox, shown right here. He was a very conservative Republican on the show, and his two parents here were hippies, more kind of a liberal, liberal Democrats. And so this show was kind of the exception in Family Ties, was the exception to the rule, where you had a conservative Republican son. Okay, his idol was Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, and you have liberal Democrat parents. So again, this is more the exception rather than the rule. Now, I probably should have used, blue for Democrats and red for Republican, but this is the idea that family influence is going to have a huge factor in how you end up voting. Okay, and again, where does political socialization happen? Schools teach patriotism. For example, high school civics. If you're watching this right now, chances are you're enrolled in AP Government, or maybe you're not enrolled in AP Government. Maybe you're enrolled in regular high school civics, and you want an extra tutorial to help you pass the AP Government exam. So there clearly is the idea that there's the base of information that Americans have, and they're socialized to the idea of what our Constitution is about. So this happens at the high school level. Demographic factors, for example, the gender gap. You look at women, they tend to vote more Democrat than men do, and so these are factors. Also, mass media. Now, mass media in the past might have represented TV, but now in the age of the internet, the way that we consume our information, we don't get as centralized information as we do before. If I ask students if they've watched the presidential debates, a lot of them they haven't, because there's so many other options. Whereas maybe if this was a high school class in 1960, all of them were glued to the TV or listening to radio, because there's more centralized information. So we're becoming a little bit more decentralized in how we consume our information. But again, we're still there's still a base of commonalities that we have as Americans. So measuring public opinion. So how is it that public opinion is actually measured? There's early polling data in the United States. There are some problems because they had some self-selecting biases. What does that mean? There's self-selecting simply means that there's a characteristic of people that would participate in these polls that's not representative of the general population. So there were these straw polls that simply asked the same question to a large number of people, irrespective of where they came from. It's just they just asked these people, and they tallied it. And based on these results, they made predictions on the election. Well, again, this is not indicative of a cross-section of American population. The Literary Digest predicted that Alf Landon would defeat President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1936 presidential election. And we know in hindsight that President Roosevelt won pretty handily in 1936. The reason why was that the Literary Digest, they used car registrations and telephone directories to reach over 10 million people. So that was an accomplishment, that they had such a large sample size, but the characteristics of people that they interviewed, people that had cars, people that had telephones, these were people that probably weren't suffering the greatest effects of the Great Depression. And so you had a problem with generally a wealthier subset of the population were being interviewed, and that's why this Literary Digest, which they didn't use the right sampling techniques, they had a flawed way of collecting data. Now, the modern polling began in the 1930s with a man by the name of George Gallup. So the way that we poll today, with two L's here, was invented by this George Gallup. And so today we have a Gallup poll among the various different polls that are used to measure what public opinion is all about. Now, what are some elements of a successful poll? Now, elements of a successful poll have to do with sampling techniques, being able to prepare clear and valid questions, also being able to control how the poll is taken, so being able to know, what method, and also analyzing and reporting results. That's also important here. So sampling, what I said before here, a straw poll is simply just asking whoever and reporting the results. What I find is that when a lot of students conduct polls and surveys at our school, they don't get an accurate cross-section of the school population. They just basically they're conducting straw polls in their data. They just ask random people and they tabulate the results, and that's not an accurate way to get the mood of the American people. So sampling, those chosen must be done so at random and be representative of the voting population. Again, there's different statistical techniques that you can use nowadays that, back in the early 20th century, a lot of these techniques were not well known or used. Okay. Also, being able to prepare clear and valid questions. So let's say in 1998, when this whole Monica Lewinsky scandal, when President Clinton, when that erupted, let's hypothetically pose two possible questions that could be asked to give you an idea of how the wording of a question can influence the results. Do you believe that President Clinton should be impeached for lying to the American public? That's one possible question. And another possible question could be, do you believe that President Clinton should be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors? So depending on the wording, seems like the first question, well, yes. And then the second question, well, he may not have told the truth, but does this fit to the high crimes and misdemeanors? So again, being able to prepare clear and valid questions is something that's important. Referring to the fact, Bill Clinton, this picture that you see right here, actually, you could detail a lot of different things in terms of whether he lied or not to the American public, but this incident is when he went to the American people and he basically denied any allegations with wrongdoing with Monica Lewinsky, and he pointed to the camera and said, "I did not have relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." And so he went and he pointed to the camera, straight to the American people, and he denied having a relationship with Monica Lewinsky. So that is something, whether or not you believe that's an impeachable offense or not, how it's phrased. Now, if it was phrased in a way where it was whether or not you believe he should be impeached because he lied in a deposition in a courtroom, that might have a significant difference in whether or not the American public would actually believe this was an impeachable offense or not. Because when you phrase a question, how you phrase it and the manner in which will sway a vote, an individual in answering one way over another. Okay, controlling how a poll is taken. Methods could involve telephone, mail, and in-person interviews. One of the problems with this day and age is that a lot of individuals simply don't have landlines. So when you call people with just landlines and use that method, that's fairly an outdated method because you're eliminating a huge cross-section of the population. I personally don't have a landline myself. I know some people, my sister still has a landline, but when you eliminate a huge portion of the population that don't own landlines, these people probably tend to share certain voting characteristics that are different than those that do own landlines. So in this day and age, it's probably a little bit more difficult using email addresses. Email, that might be problematic because some people might not use email. So there are definitely a lot of challenges associated with polling techniques. And also analyzing and reporting results here. So providing information about how the poll was taken, sampling errors, and further statistical analysis. These are all elements of a successful poll in trying to measure the public opinion of voters. So let's take a look at the 1948 election. I don't have any text here. It's this picture, exemplifies the flaws of the polling techniques back in 1948. It predicted that Dewey defeats Truman, and this newspaper went to print. And obviously, we don't have a President Thomas Dewey. Harry Truman in 1948, he came back and won the election. A lot of it had to do with inaccurate sampling, data, lack of information. So Thomas Dewey was convinced that he would become president. The media had reported it. They were very confident. But Harry Truman took this underdog mentality, even though he was an incumbent. And clearly he's pretty giddy that he was able to pull off an upset. In today's day and age, while it may sound great for a politician to take on this underdog mentality, the reality is that with all the polling techniques and all the ways that information is taken as to presidential preference, very unlikely that a presidential election is going to be up in the air. Now, again, with certain elections, absolutely, but it's pretty apparent who is clearly in the lead going into the presidential election. Obviously, things can change over time, but because polling data has become so scientific nowadays, it's pretty difficult for a situation like what happened in 1948 to happen in a modern day election. Just there's so much availability of statistical data that's used to prevent this type of situation. So let's take a look at the election of 2008 as a comparison, and also 2012. So again, in 2008 and 2012, let's give an example of how, you know, being a political prognosticator is much more possible today than it was back then. So in March 2008, a guy by the name of Nate Silver established a blog, 538.com, establishing a system of tracking polls. So what 538 obviously represents, there's 538 electoral votes. So let's go ahead and write this down here. So there's 538 electoral votes, and the magic number is 270 electoral votes. Now, what's kind of interesting is that George Bush in the year 2000, he actually barely got 271, and Al Gore got 266. You had one faithless elector. So George Bush, you know, barely had enough of the electoral votes to become the president of the United States. But, you know, our system of government is based on electoral votes, right? So 538 was kind of an appropriate website to establish a system of tracking polls. And in 2008, Nate Silver, he gained a lot of notoriety. He was able to correctly predict certain primaries. In 2008, Silver correctly predicted 49 of the 50 states, plus Washington, D.C. He only missed Indiana. He incorrectly predicted a McCain victory. And he predicted all the Senate races. So, you know, the polls, you know, did a good job. He was able to aggregate all the polls and use statistical analysis to figure out who was going to win, you know, all the elections in 2008. And 2012 is even more impressive on some counts. Silver got all 50 states plus DC right, and he got 31 of the 33 Senate seats right. Okay, so in this day and age, you have individuals with all this access to data, basically able to combine a lot of these polling techniques and based on that, make a prediction as well. And what was Nate Silver's background, you ask? Well, he was a sabermetrician. Now, what the heck is a sabermetrician? It's basically someone who takes a bunch of baseball statistics and makes some conclusions using advanced techniques. And basically, he used the idea that you could, you know, predict a baseball player's behavior, and he applied that to the world of politics, right? And give you an interesting epilogue to Nate Silver. He joined ESPN with his site, 538.com, and the brand was bought out in July 2013. Now, whether Nate Silver is going to rejoin the world of politics in 2016 to predict, you know, the next president of the United States, or 2020 or whatnot, it's a matter for him to decide or not. But basically, the idea is that what happened in 1948 with Harry Truman and you know, the media predicting that Dewey would defeat Truman, very unlikely scenario in this day and age with public polling techniques. So example number one, let's take a look at this here. Which of the following is not a concept found in American political culture? Well, let's take a look at the ones that are, and let's erase those here. Private property. That absolutely is. We Americans do value private property. You know, we believe in this idea of life, liberty, and property, also the pursuit of happiness. Equality of rights. Absolutely, it is found in our political culture. Equality of outcome. Now again, we don't want to have, you know, we do want to have an idea like a base level where people, you know, are not below this certain level here, but you know, we don't ostracize rich people for being rich. Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, yes, people might be envious of them, but we don't lambast them for having riches. That's, you know, part of American political culture, that some people are going to be richer than others. Majority rule. Yes, that is something that we find. Compromise, again, in today's political climate, you might argue that no, there's no compromise. You know, Tea Party Republicans want this, you know, liberal Democrats want that. But there's a system that allows for compromise, a presidential system of government. So the correct answer is equality of outcome. That is not something that's part of American political culture. Okay, example number 2. The process by which citizens acquire a sense of their own political identity would be best defined as which of the following? So how do you become the person that you are with the political ideas that you currently have? Is it through public opinion? I'm sure that affects, partly, but that's not the process by which you arrive to your own conclusion. Political socialization, that sounds right, so I'm going to leave that in there. Demographics, you know what, that might be play a factor, but that's not how you become socialized in your beliefs. Political culture, again, this is how everyone believes what these are accepted values and norms, but that's not the process by which you acquire your own political identity. Again, patriotism, again, that would not be the correct answer. So the correct answer is political socialization. And again, family, family, how your family believed, or how your family was registered under what political party, that's a huge determinant in how you're going to end up voting in terms of whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent. Okay, example number 3. Attempting to measure public opinion by asking the same question of a large number of people is called which of the following? Sampling poll. Again, sampling poll would be you're taking a small group of people and collecting data from the population as a whole. So it wouldn't be asking the same question. That's not necessarily the characteristic of a sampling poll, so that's incorrect. So controlling poll, that doesn't strike or ring a bell at all. Scientific poll, I mean, it could be a scientific poll, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. A literary poll, again, that doesn't really fit the definition here. The correct answer, this one, is a straw poll. Now, a straw poll, it has its benefits. Iowa has a straw poll, well before the presidential elections. And usually it's ultra conservatives that attend, and that's usually an indicator of who the leading conservative is, at least for the Republicans. So, Republicans will have straw polls, Democrats will have straw polls. Again, they're not seen as necessarily scientific. It's interesting, but it doesn't really have a whole lot of value. And finally, let's look at example number 4 here. Which presidential election did political pollsters get it wrong by predicting that Thomas Dewey would defeat incumbent Harry Truman here? So let's take a look at these elections here. Let's eliminate the ones that are absolutely wrong first here. Election 1932, election 1948, election 1960, election 1968, election 1969. That is absolutely wrong. Presidential elections happen every 4 years. An election cannot happen in an odd numbered year. Now, in 1989, George H.W. Bush became the president on January 20th due to the 20th Amendment, but he was elected in 1988. So let's go back. Election of 1932. Election of 1932, it was Herbert Hoover versus Franklin Roosevelt. So that's clearly not the answer, so let's erase this. 1948, let's skip that for now. Just let's see what the other choices are. 1960, you have John F. Kennedy, the Democrats, versus Richard Nixon. It was the first presidential election with a televised debates, and a lot of political analysts argued that John F. Kennedy appeared to win the debate on TV, and that influenced the election heavily, but it had nothing to do with Dewey and Truman. And in 1968, Richard Nixon, perhaps he learned the reason maybe why he lost the presidency in 1960 was that he was he lost because he didn't have the public image that John F. Kennedy did. So Richard Nixon did not agree to televised presidential debates. And so a lot of people say that, that's partly what, led to his election in 1968. And again, that did not involve Dewey or Thomas here. So this was in 1948 here. So obviously you have Dewey versus, not Dewey versus Thomas, but Dewey versus Truman. So this happened in 1948. So something that will probably never happen in the sense of a newspaper predicting that would happen and there being a huge surprise in the presidential race. It's just in today's modern era, we just have way too many statistical sample sizes and ways of predicting, how Americans will vote in presidential elections. Thank you for watching educator.com.